And we're going to have a look at assignment 1, which is not terribly large. It's a 1-page assignment. Okay, so it's now on Blackboard. It's due next week, so Thursday, so you have a week to do it, Thursday night. Okay. So here's what you have to do. You're going to make a simple calculator. Okay, it's worth 20% of your grade. It's basically a single-page application. You don't need to use the database at all for this.
Do we have a week to finish 20%?
You have a week to build 1 page. If you can't build 1 page, well, I know you can, otherwise you wouldn't be in your 3rd semester at college if you couldn't build a 1-page application in a week. So to submit, you just have to zip up the whole solution, upload it to Blackboard. You have to do the work yourself. It's not group work. So what you're going to do is a calculator, basically, kind of like a bigger version of the tip calculator we built in class a few weeks ago, and the source code for that is online. So here's a sample link to the solution. I'll show you the end product so you can see exactly what you're building. So here's your 1 page. So I've used a master page just to build a simple header and footer. And it's a simple calculator where user has to input all the values here. You've got to include input validation. So I've got to make sure all my radio buttons are selected. So that rule goes away. It says there's no ties or draws. So if I pick 2 here and 2 here, I get a validation saying, well, one of these numbers has to be higher than the other.
So if there was a tie, it kind of...
Well, if there's a tie, you can't submit and do the calculation. When there's a tie, there has to be an error shown. Okay. All the numbers also have to be positive. So if I go below 0, I get an error telling me that I've got to be at 0 or higher. Same here. There can't be -4 people watching the game. There can only be 0 or higher. So basically, I have to be able to complete this for all 4 sections. So there's validation in each section. And when I click calculate, I'll get these things totaled up. So how many wins were there in total? How many losses? So you'll have to add with your radio button selections. What percentage of the games were won? How many total points scored? How many total points against? What's the difference between those? What was the total number of spectators and the average per game? That's the whole assignment.
If you have time today, can you go over again how to display the results?
How to?
Display the results at the bottom of the page.
Sure.
That's what I had a difficulty with.
Sure, we can do that. We'll look at the tip calculator from 2 weeks ago, which I think we did that on, yes. Okay. So the link is here, so you can see exactly what you're building. Okay. I just used Bootstrap in a few of the classes for do the styling. You don't have to get carried away with the styling. Like against, how many points the other team, how many points your team allowed. So this was how many points your team scored, and that was how many the other team scored.
So it's for your team.
Yeah. So you need to build a master page and a CSS file. Again, you can either write your own CSS, you can use a framework like Bootstrap or Foundation. I don't care. CSS doesn't have to be fancy. There should just be some basic layout and style to it. And the master page should have some kind of site title and a basic footer. Okay, so I just put in, there was my basic footer, there's my fancy header. So you can just call the one page, just call the page default, and then you need 4 separate sections, basically each one's repeated. Okay, so I've described all of the inputs and all of the validation rules. That the points scored and points allowed have to be different for each game, and none of the numbers can be negative. They all have to be 0 or higher. So you'll have to check using the validators, which we'll start looking at in a few minutes, how the .NET validators work. They're really easy. And then when the user clicks summary or calculate, doesn't really matter what the button says, you'll calculate out these 8 results. So you'll have to add some calculations into the click event of that, the click method of that button that will calculate and display each of these results in a separate label. Okay, and I've explained the two. So what I mean by winning percentage, so for example, if I pick win 3 times, it should show 0.75 or 75% as the winning percentage. And the point differential is simply the difference between this value in D and this value in E. So if points scored is 10 and points allowed is 5, the point differential is 5. If points scored is 5, points allowed is 10, the point differential is -5.
So is the calculator thing on lesson 3?
Yep. The tip calculator we did is lesson 3. And we'll look at it because I'll answer Kaylee's question in regards to that. Okay, so here's how I'm going to mark you. A couple marks just for getting the application set up and running. For marking everybody's labs, I know those are 2 easy marks because everybody already knows how to set up and get a .NET application running. Everyone who submitted the lab, which I think is pretty much everybody in here, was able to do that part. A couple marks just for including the master page and linking to a CSS file. 4 marks for setting up the inputs, 8 marks for doing the validation, 8 marks for the calculation, 2 for displaying the results properly, and 2 for commenting your code. If there's any other additional .NET features you can think to add here, I'll give you up to 2 bonus marks for anything else you want to do with it. Although off the top of my head, I can't see what other functionality you can really add to this. If you can think of something, by all means, go for it. Okay, and the link to the sample app is right here in the document. So at any point you want to see what you're building, just click on that, keep that open, and that'll give you an idea of what the end product is supposed to look like and how it works. So the data is not saved, it's not being connected to a database. You just have to build the solution with a master page, 1 CSS file, and 1 page called default.aspx. You don't have to build anything else. Are there any questions? The other reason I'm going to make it due the end of next week is so that I can mark it before your midterm, so everybody we have more than one lab worth of your mark as you're going into the midterm. So before the midterm, I'll have marked all these so everybody will know what their grade is so far in the course. Okay, so this is on Blackboard, so before class next week, and Kaylee, we'll get to your question. So I'm going to open up our solution from week 3 and get it running. So this section, what we did was we put it, if memory serves, and I'll pull up the code, I think we used an ASP panel tag. If I just inspect the element, which renders as, it renders as a div tag at runtime, but because we use the ASP panel tag, we can access it on the server, and it has a visible property which we can access. So when our page loads for the first time, so here was our HTML. So we had this whole results section is in this ASP panel, and we set the visible property to false. So when the page loads, this element's there, but it's hidden it's hidden by the server. Okay, so when we first come in here and load it, you see this class ASP.NET hidden, but that section isn't actually here, right? It's there with the server tag, but the end user doesn't actually see it. So then in our code, we have our click function called when the user clicks the button. So in our code, when the user clicks the button, whoops, sorry, that's not the right page, it's here. So we had our 4 lines for figuring out how much was the tip and how much was the total. And then the last thing we did was we changed the visible property from false to true.
Okay, and you still need to put like the label or else it won't pull from.
Right, so we still had to display, so this prints the tip.
Okay. And it just finds the label.
Yeah, so this line of code, yeah, it finds the label and it prints that first value here. So that line happens first. Then we're figuring out how much the total is by adding the tip to the subtotal, and then we're populating our total label. So after line 32 runs, now we get an amount printed here. And then we turn the whole section to visible. Doesn't really matter what order. We could do this right at the beginning.
But it depends on where in your HTML you put that, like the.
Well, it really doesn't matter. We could have put the results up here or over here. It will be wherever we want it to go, and we can make it visible whenever we want to. So that's one option. There's different ways to show and hide. Another option would be we could have a visible and a hidden class in our CSS, and rather than toggling the visible property from false to true, our other option would have been we could change the class. We could set the CSS class in this event to show, and then that would use our selector rule from our CSS that would make that visible. So by default here, we could have just given it a, instead of setting visible to false, we could have set CSS class equals hidden. So same effect. You could do it either way. Whatever you're comfortable with, we're going to get the same result. Yeah, so the panel just renders as a div tag, and then you can treat it like we could do it with any. Technically, I suppose you could even do it with a regular div tag, but in order to be able to access it from here, you still have to give it the run@equals-server attribute. So usually, if I want to access that element on the server, I'll use an ASP tag anyway, because it's already wired up to the server to do that. So on the calculator, I did the same thing. So I used an ASP panel. I gave it a bootstrap class, I think it's called well, that gives it that border and the rounded. And by default, when the page loads, it's invisible. And on calculate, after I do all the calculations and print all the values to the label, I just toggle it, the visibility from false to true. So exactly what we did on the tip calculator. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So a big part of what you have to do for the assignment is validation. So what we're going to do is play around with all of the ASP.NET validators. So let's I'll leave these solutions open just in case we need them. And one thing I am going to take, actually what I'm going to show you as we're setting up our solution today. Pacha, you have a question?
For the score and allowed, are you just looking for the difference of how many points
In which section?
like we're doing score and allowed, right?
Yep.
What are we showing? Are we showing like the difference?
So, okay, let's say I do this. So in each game, the score is 1-0. Okay? I score 1 and I allow 0 in every game.
-1.
So the first thing we're going to check in each game is that somebody has to win. Okay, the points can't be the same. One of those two numbers has to be higher than the other. It doesn't matter which number's higher, they just can't be the same. Okay, so every game we have to play till somebody wins, in effect. So if I win all the games 1-0, and I'll have to just put in a spectator for each. When I hit calculate, the point difference result will be 4. +1, +2, +3, +4, okay? So it says my team scored 4 points in total across all 4 games. So I added these numbers together to get that result. Then I added this to get the total allowed. So the point difference is just, we're subtracting this number from that number.
What kind of game is this?
Could be anything, it's just generic.
It's one spectator.
Could be anything.
Oh, so we're not adding like spectators and stuff?
Yes, we are. So the total attendance here was 4. So you've got to sum these, you've got to sum those, you've got to sum those, and then you have to take the difference between those two, that gives you the differential, and then you also have to calculate the average of the attendance. Okay, so if these were, if these were NHL hockey games, the attendance would be something like, probably like that, right? It would be those kind of numbers. Right, those would be more, that would be the size of a, a basketball arena or a hockey arena would have that number of spectators. So that would give you, an average over 4 games, something like that. So Sleeve, and I made it generic, it could be apply to anything. Yeah, could be baseball, could be, your little brother's soccer game where the only people watching are, the 20 parents. Doesn't matter. Well, there you go. Yeah, I don't even know if you'd count them. They're off picking flowers instead of watching. So the other thing I want to borrow, we're going to make a new solution for today. So this is what we did last week. We set up this master page, and we already linked to jQuery and to Bootstrap. So what I want to do, rather than setting up a master page all over again, I'm going to use this one from last week. So what I'm going to do is make a new solution for today. So I'll make a new project. So I'll pick C# and web, as we've been doing. Call it COMP2084 Lesson 5. And as we've been doing, I'll pick an empty template and choose web forms.
Oh.
So the same thing we've done the last few weeks.
And I guess empty.
If you don't pick web forms, can you go back and change it, or you have to start over?
No, because it will build. You'll have to build a new one because you'll get very different. You get a very different template with a whole bunch of other things and certain things missing that we'll need. So technically, could you change it? Yes. It's a lot of work, though, to go through and change it. You're better off just to build a new one. So we're going to have a blank solution. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my solution from last week first, because I want to copy last week's master page. So if you have the solution from last week, you don't really need the master page. If it's on Blackboard, if you don't have it. So I'm going to go into my Lesson 4 folder from last week. And I'm going to take my lesson 4.master, these three files. So there's a .master, .master.cs that has our C# code, and then there's the master designer file that links these two, the first two together. I'm going to copy those three files, and then I'm going to paste them into the directory where my solution is for today. And then we can add it into our lesson 5 project. So again, just go into last week's solution, grab these three files called lesson 4.master. And then I'll open up the project directory the Visual Studio just created. So here's my lesson 5 that has basically our empty template. I'm just going to paste these in here.
So where are we getting this from? Lesson 5?
No, we're in lesson 5 now. That's this week.
Okay, so
You've got to go into lesson 4 because the files all are called lesson 4. They all start with the name lesson 4.master. Okay, that's fine.
Yes, I
Your file only has one.
.master and .master.
That's interesting. That's okay. Add those in. It'll probably, Visual Studio should say, so you're missing the second one, the lesson 4.master.cs, or you're missing the designer file. Okay, well, we'll see what happens when you add them into Visual Studio. So now they're in here, but if I go back to Visual Studio, notice they don't show up yet. So they're in our directory, but they're not included in the project yet. So to add those files to the project, if you go over to your Solution Explorer on the right, there's a button right here, the last icon on this little toolbar. When I mouse over it, it says Show All Files. So I'm going to click on that.
I don't have that.
And now it shows me and it's outlined lesson 4.master. So Visual Studio recognizes that this file's in that project directory, but it's not part of our project yet. So to include it in the project, just one sec. If I right click lesson 4.master, there's an option that says include in project. So when I include it, it includes for me both the master and the CS and the designer. So we've basically copied the master page from last week's project into this week's project. So this is how we can take a file if we want to move it around. We build a file we want to reuse, like let's say a login page. We built it in one project, we want to add it to another. We can copy it to the directory, and then we can just click Show All Files and include that file, folder, or group of files in our project.
Show files.
Show All Files. Now we can leave that button turned on, or we can just turn it off. I'll just turn it off.
I'm not quite sure to use it, but like,
So now I want to compile the solution because we've added a new item to it, to our project.
so how you select? It's my.
The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this. It's called Lesson 4. We're going to kind of reuse this master page each week. So what I'm going to do is right-click it, click on Rename. I'm just going to call it Site.master. We'll give it a generic name rather than calling it Lesson 4. So Visual Studio renames all of the matching files to Site.master. So now we can work with this master page each week rather than setting it up repeatedly.
So how did you select to get the 4, like to get the transfer those files into there?
Okay.
Sorry.
I went to my Lesson 4 folder.
Okay.
I selected all of the 3 files called Lesson 4.master.
Okay.
Copy them. go to your lesson 5 folder, your project directory for today,
Oh, okay.
paste them in here. So now they're part of your lesson 5 folder.
All right.
And then in Solution Explorer, if you click the Show All Files button, those files should show up when you click Show All Files. And then you can just right-click the master page and choose Include in Project.
No. Oh, well.
So I'm going to add a couple things here in the master page before our navigation bar. So I'm going to add in a link to our home page, so we'll always create a page called default. So I'm just putting in line 21. So we basically have a heading beside our main navigation.
So is there any way that the file hosted on Blackboard is corrupted? It says it's 0 kilobytes. I'm going to try to...
I'll check.
It also doesn't show all files.
Okay. All right. Hang on. One thing at a time. I'm a man. It means I can't multitask.
Archive's not readable. Would you like to try a password?
So this file is corrupt? Okay.
COMP2084 lesson 4.0.
It's 34 kilobytes on my machine, but yeah, that's fine. I can upload it. I can change it and upload it again. No problem.
It says mine's 33 kilobytes.
Maybe I'll
Okay.
just re-download it.
I just put it up again. Okay, Kaylee, can you ask that question again, please? You have my full attention.
Sorry, this page, the .master.
Yep.
Is not in that file that you uploaded, and it's not bringing that.
Yes, it is. Right here.
I'm trying to re-download the one
It's right here. Dated last Friday.
So you wrote a whole new line in there, another.
All I did was put a link tag in there.
All right.
So each week we'll import the master page, but we're going to change the links depending on whatever it is we're doing.
There's only 2 master pages.
What files do you have?
Lesson 4 master and lesson 4 master.designer.
That's fine. Just import those. If it doesn't find the CS file, Visual Studio may prompt you. It may say there's no CS file. Do you want to create one? Just say yes. There's no code in the master CS file. We didn't write any code. Actually, we wrote just a little bit of code here that puts the time in the footer. It's not critical that it's there. It won't. If you're missing that, it won't break. But my zip file has it, at least as far as I can tell. Right, here's my zip file. Every time I open it up, it's there. So if you can't see all of those 3 files, I'm not sure I have an explanation for you.
I do. On mine, it doesn't have the extension on it. It just says lesson 4. And then in the type, it says master page. So it depends on...
Gotcha. So you're on a Mac, and so are you two.
Yeah, but I'm using.
It may still be the settings of how when you configured Windows, that it's not showing the extension.
I'm using Windows 8.
Are you using it natively or the last 8?
But it's still there, it's still the file. It's
Yeah, the file's there. It's not critical. There's nothing critical in the C# file other than we're calculating the date and time and putting it in the footer. If you're missing that, the world will still keep spinning, I'm pretty sure. So we'll use this master page. We won't worry about these other links. At least we have a basic header and footer now. Okay. So let's add a default page to this project. So I'm going to right-click my project, choose Add New Item, and we want a web form with a master page, which we'll call Default. So pretty much we're always going to use a master page, so whenever we're adding new pages, we're going to be choosing this option, web form with master page.
Can we name it default?
Default. That'll always be the first page of every solution. And because we've said we want it to use a master page, after we choose click OK, Visual Studio will prompt us to pick a master page. We only have one master page, so we'll just choose site.master.
Oh, okay. Trying to follow along. Yeah. You went too fast.
Sorry, I just got like jumbled up in thoughts.
Whenever we add a page to the project, which we're going to be doing regularly, we're always going to use a master page. So we're going to go through it. It's going to be the same every time. Okay? So you right-click your project, choose Add New Item, and this is going to be our standard, a web form with a master page. If we pick a regular web form, it won't use our master page, so it won't have any header footer. So we want a web form with master page, and we will always make the first page called default. And because we're using a master page, we now have to pick what master page is providing the template for this ASPX file. If you don't have this come up, then you probably didn't pick web form with master page. You probably picked a different option.
I went web form master page just now.
Okay, well, I'll come and have a look at it when I have a break. So I'm going to put a title on my page of input validation. So notice there's no header, HTML, body tags, because all of those things are going to live in our master page. This is just the main content. So we've got a blank page. Just put on a heading. ASP.NET input validation. And we'll just launch our website. There's no code on here. I'll just choose Start Without Debugging. So we basically just have an empty page. We've got our header and footer from last week. So your footer, you may not have the timestamp, doesn't matter. My header's rather large. I think we'll scale back my H1 a bit. With something a little smaller. Notice also, I never pointed this out before, if I change the opening tag, Visual Studio automatically changed the closing tag. So all I had to do was change the opening tag from a 1 to a 3 and it changes.
It saves so much time trying to find the end.
I'm not going to follow.
There are also a bunch of shortcuts, so you don't even have to type the closing tag. That Visual Studio will generate it. Yeah. So what we want to do on here, we're going to build a form. We're going to put some controls on, and then we're going to look at how Visual Studio, how we can handle validation of inputs with ASP.NET. Okay, basically automates, as you might imagine, it automates a lot of things for us. Okay, so we'll build a simple form. I'm going to go back to my master page for a minute. I'm just going to apply a class to the form. So right here, should be on your line 28 is your form tag. So I'm going to use a class from Bootstrap. It's form horizontal. So we're going to look at, put a bunch of form controls on our default page and look at how we can use ASP.NET for doing validation. So we'll set out a few field sets. So I'll put on first a label and text ASP text box. Now we can use HTML5 validation, but as I think probably most of you know by now, HTML5 validation is not foolproof. There still are users, particularly people who work in large institutions, who are stuck with old browsers, and they have no ability to install other browsers or upgrade. In fact, I had a programming student say on his last co-op, he was working for one of the Ontario government ministries, and they were using IE6. That was the only browser available. And he had no ability to upgrade. So for today, we're not going to use HTML5 validation. We're just going to use strictly the .NET validations.
Everyone seems to be like, no, we'll just use JavaScript to do it. Don't bother with HTML5.
So this so far will be similar to what you did on the labs. We're going to put on a name box. We'll put on a password. We're going to put on 2 password boxes. We'll call this one txt password. What other attribute do we have to set so that the characters are hidden as the user types? Right now, this is just a regular text box. I need to set one of the other properties.
Type password.
It's not actually type. You're close. Yeah, we want to set the text mode to password. That will generate it as an input type equals password. So now we want to confirm password because we're going to want to make sure, and we're going to want to make sure we get the same password twice. So 3 text boxes. ASP text boxes, all with runout equals server. If anybody's having a problem getting their master page to work, just add a regular web form to the page and you can add the HTML. If you don't have the master page, it doesn't break anything. So you can still add this into a regular web form. So we'll set text mode equals password here as well. We'll also put on a text box where people will put in the year they were born. Actually, we'll make it even simpler. We'll just call it txt age. People can put in their age. So we'll have 4 text boxes, name, 2 password boxes, and an age box. This will give us a chance to play around with some of the different validators. And the last thing we'll do is just put on a button.
Would you want to do, like a specific type for the age, or would you just let it?
Well, what we're going to do at the moment, when we first run the page, it's going to be open, and then we're going to use some of the different ASP.NET validation controls to enforce all of the rules that our page should have. I mean, we can do things like use type equals number in HTML5, but again, somebody with an old browser is going to get around that. So we'll put on an ASP button. We'll just give it an ID of btn submit. The runout equals server. Our text can say submit. I'll give it a class. And we want Visual Studio to write a click event for us. So on click, when I type equals, we'll get this little prompt that says create new event. And that will write the click method for us in the C# code. And notice as soon as I did that, my C# file now has unsaved changes. There's a little star up here. So we really don't need much to happen. We just want to print out a message when the user clicks submit, but obviously we're going to want to enforce some validation rules here. So what things are we going to want to do? What rules should we enforce that have to happen in order for the user to be allowed to submit the form? Okay, we'll want to make sure that all the fields are filled out. So we could add an HTML5 required attribute if we wanted, but we'll use the .NET validator. So that'll be one. All the fields will be required. What else will we want to check in terms of our rules? Yeah, we want to make sure that they didn't give us two different passwords. And what would be the other thing we want to check? Could be, because I think you mentioned it.
Page is the number.
Right, we're going to want to make sure this is a numeric value, but will we accept any number here?
Nope, 18 no.
Okay, so we probably are going to want to have at least some kind, well, we certainly should have a minimum. What should the absolute minimum be? 1 or 0, right? We're not going to let somebody have a negative, and if it's an age, we probably aren't going to allow much beyond, I don't know, 120 is probably a reasonable upper limit, I would think. If they're much older than that, and they can fill out our form, well, good for them. So we've got a whole bunch of validation rules we'll want to enforce here. So I'll just save all my changes, and maybe I'll just put a little note up at the top. I'll put a smaller tag in H6. Maybe I'll say all fields are required. And the last thing we'll do just underneath my button, we'll put on an ASP label. I'll call it LBL message, and we'll add the runout equals server attribute. So all we want to do when the user clicks the button, if they've made any validation errors, we'll want to stop them and show those errors. If they've filled out the form completely, the passwords match, and they've given us a acceptable numeric value for age, we'll print a message into this label. That's all this page will do. Sure. Just give me 1 second. We're going to add one line of code here, and then I'll put it back up, Adam. Okay. So once you have this HTML, when I did this on click and let Visual Studio, when I chose create new event, Visual Studio wrote this click method for us. So all we're going to do is print a message. So we'll set LBL message.text to just say, that's it. We don't need to save the data. We're not calculating. We just want something to happen when the form is complete, and if the form's incomplete, that message doesn't show up. Yep, and then I will load the master page as well. You need to go up or down, where you can see what you need.
Just the very bottom.
Very bottom? Okay. So all of this stuff gets embedded inside of our master page when this loads at runtime, right? The master provides the template, the HTML framework, header, footer, and this content just sits in the middle. And Adam, you need to see the master page? Okay. Which part of the master do you need to see?
Just like where you enter class.
Okay. Kenzie, you got what you need here? So the master page is not critical here. If you have to just build this as a standalone page without the header and footer, that's fine. It really doesn't affect what we're doing today. If you don't have the master page, not the end of the world. So I'm just going to recompile my project and just make sure the form shows up the way we want it to show up. But right now there's no validation on it. So if I'll just recompile. So here's our form. Just make sure that our password is hidden. Seems to be. But right now we get that message no matter what, right? I can leave the whole form blank. Still, where I can still submit. So we set up the form, but right now we're not doing any checking. So what we'll do, it's 10 to 9, we will take a break here, and when we come back, we'll look at how we can enforce all of the validation rules that we need. How do we make all the fields required? How do we check that the passwords match? And how do we make sure we get an acceptable value, both in terms of the data, type of data, that it's a number, and the range, that we're not getting an age too low or too high. So I will leave this up. I can scroll up or down. If anybody needs to see a different part of the code, we'll come back at 9 and start working on the validation piece. It's pretty simple.